For the person who is injured in an accident, what of their life now versus the life that could have been? For the person who dies in an accident, what of their loved ones now left behind? Hey, this is Marc Reid from Pre-Site Safety, and you're listening to the Pre-Site Podcast. This is episode 6 of the Pre-Site Podcast. On the programme today, I'm sharing with you a much shortened version of the safety impact speech that I've had the great privilege of sharing with company audiences over the past few years. That story namely being that of my father, Marc Archibald Reid, and his survival of the 1988 Piper Alpha disaster. In this version of the speech, and beyond that personal story, I also touch on the Domino Fallacy concept that we've now written about at great length and talked about in the previous episode of this podcast, episode 5, talking about the fact that we have a tendency to look in great detail at the short-term events leading up to an accident and the short-term events happening after an accident, but we all tend to forget and not document very well everything that happens in the much longer term after an accident. It's very, very difficult to look at those longer term events in great detail, and indeed to bring those sorts of events into safety management in any quantitative sense. So we mentioned that in the speech that you'll hear in a few minutes. And I also touch on some other examples of accidents where you get to see the more general nature of this domino fallacy concept and why it matters much further and much more broadly than the obvious case of the personal story I'm telling about my dad. So a little bit of context for this version of my speech that you're about to hear. Back in August 2020, so just earlier this year, I was kindly invited to give this talk by some US colleagues of mine at the Chemical Abstract Service, a division of the American Chemical Society, a body that had supported me a great deal in the earlier stages of my academic career. And so they invited me back to give a version of my safety speech to their international audience, primarily composed of chemists, both in academia and industry. So I mentioned a moment ago that this version of the speech touches on examples of accidents where the domino fallacy concept matters beyond the case of my dad. And the two examples that you'll hear, which I'll say a little bit more about after you've heard the speech, are very much relevant to a chemistry audience. And as time goes on in future episodes of the podcast, we may even tell some more stories about other accidents beyond oil and gas, beyond my dad, and beyond chemistry. But for now, please enjoy this shortened version of my safety impact speech, All the Dominoes Fall. We'll be back after the speech is over to talk about some of the questions that came up on the night and to discuss some of the concepts in a little bit more detail. I'll speak to you soon.
Next up, we have Dr. Marc Reid, lecturer at the University of Bristol and co-founder of a safety culture and accident readiness company, Pre-Site Safety. He earned his Master of Science and PhD in chemistry from the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. Dr. Reid was in the 2016 CAS Future Leaders Program. Dr. Reid?
Thanks very much indeed, Peter, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in and is sticking around for the other stories this evening. Before I get to mine, I want to ask you one question, and it's a question related to the slide that you can see in front of you. as you look at that domino, think about this. What is that domino hiding? As you stare that domino in the face, what is it that you cannot see? And we'll come back to that question in due course. But for now, my story this evening begins in this small part of the world close to where I live, where on the northeast coast of Scotland, there used to exist this red platform called Piper Alpha. It was an oil rig. But due to a series of immense safety failures, on the 6th of July 1988, that once vibrant oil rig changed from the platform on the left to the burning inferno on the right. Those safety failures happened within 2 hours and caused the deaths of 167 men on board, leaving just 61 survivors. Now, of those 61 survivors, one of them was this man, Marc Reed. And if you look closer at the newspaper caption here, we can read on the bottom, Marc Reed was battling to get back to normal family life with his wife and 14-week-old son. It will be no secret as a namesake that I was in fact that 14-week-old son. And this is a story about safety, family, and how this impacts our future in chemistry. Now, this brings us back to that strange question I asked you at the start. What is it that this domino is hiding? Now, in this story of safety and others like it, I want to convince you that this domino is exactly like the details of an accident that we read in the newspapers and that we can watch on TV. We can see the immediate details and we can find out the summary of an accident. But what's much harder to do, what's far rarer to do, is to change your gaze and look further on in time. That domino could be hiding many others behind it. The first domino might simply be the initial safety failure or the accident. But what you cannot read in the newspapers and cannot watch on TV are the stories that emerge over a much longer period of time. The stories of physical injury, of bereavement, post-traumatic stress, of lost work life, perhaps even broken relationships and survivor's guilt. But I tell you again, this is not simply a story about me, my father, or even the oil and gas industry. This stretches into our own world of chemistry. All the dominoes fall. There's not just one, there might be many. But if you think of nothing else when you hear the end of this story, remember that it's not just one, but all of those dominoes will fall. And in our world of chemistry, you can look at some of the data, even just in the past 10 years, at the chemical disasters that have happened in our world. 189 disasters over time have affected almost 130,000 people. And that's just in the past 10 years and just within chemistry. And what about the small scale in our chemistry labs? Many of you will have heard the story of Sherry Sanji, who died in a lab fire at UCLA over a decade ago. The photograph you can see on the right-hand side is the remains of her lab coat. And at Hawaii University, Thea Ekins-Coward was mutilated when unsafe equipment exploded in her vicinity. These accidents, like that of the one my father was involved with, you can read about. But these accidents and the details that you can see are just the first domino to fall. So what are all the other dominoes that fall through time that you cannot see? What of Sherry's family, who now mourn the loss of their young daughter? What of Thea and her career that was cut down in its peak because she's now lost an arm? What happens to her in the longer term? And what of the father who was fortunate enough to come home to me? For him, there are no more dominoes left to fall. The horrors that he survived, he brought home with him. And for the rest of his life, he struggled with alcoholism until on the 25th of August 2011, exactly 9 years ago today, he succumbed to those struggles and died as a result of complications related to his alcoholism. From a young age until now, safety has been a massive part of my life, and I know from these details why it's so important. But this is the message that I leave you with. Wherever you are in chemistry, whatever your contribution, whatever your future innovation, none of it can happen if you do not keep safety at the forefront of your mind. Because once again, if an accident happens, that's just one domino, but all the dominoes fall. Thank you very much. Peter.
Thank you so much, Marc. That story, it moves me every time you tell it, and I've heard it a few times, and I appreciate your willingness to tell it again to the audience.
Thank you, Peter.
A couple questions coming in. The first is, how does the Beirut explosion affect you? And what is your opinion concerning it?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Very, very recent disaster, and one that's affected many, many thousands of people in Lebanon. The thing that links most closely to me is the fact that you can see very clearly in an accident like that one, for those who don't know, massive, unsafely stored container of ammonium nitrate exploded, and it sent a shockwave explosion that encapsulated most of the city and affected many thousands of people and killed hundreds. It's a very clear example of how these dominoes can fall even immediately after an accident. The building that exploded and the people inside were not the only ones affected, but it rippled out over the entire city. And you can link those short-term domino effects to the longer-term ones that I've mentioned. What's going to happen to those people now over the longer term? And we can scarcely imagine, but that's a toolkit that we can bring in to safety culture going forward.
Okay, thank you, Marc. One other question. How is this experience or what you've gone through informing your research in the safety space?
Yeah, it's not been easy. I trained more traditionally as a physical organic chemist, so it seems a bit strange anytime I tell someone that safety is a part of my research. And the way that it's informing that research is having had the experience of this story and being able to tell others about it. It's now informing and inspiring me to pick up some skills in psychology that are needed to help us understand how we as chemists and broader scientists view safety, so that we can continue to raise the bar on safety culture and decrease the number of accidents that get reported in the future. So it's a young part of my research, but I'm very, very excited about it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Marc. We appreciate it.
Thank you. So that's the end of the recording as it was back in August 2020. So there's a few things I wanted to pick up right away after listening back to that. Firstly, I always, when I'm thinking about some of the most personal details of that talk, I always mix up some of the numbers. I keep saying things like 167 men died on board of Piper Alpha, but in fact it was 165. The remaining two who perished were rescue crewmen who actually went into the blaze to help the survivors. Seemingly small point, but it was one I should get right. You heard one of the questions that I answered on the night about the recent explosion in Beirut. It had actually taken place just a few weeks before that speech recording. And for those of you who aren't aware, in Beirut, Lebanon, on the 4th of August 2020, there was a colossal explosion that was caused by, well, firstly a fire started inside a warehouse, and that fire was very close to an unsafe stockpile of ammonium nitrate, which exploded, But this was more than an explosion. It was an absolute demolition of a large part of Beirut. So at the dockside where this explosion took place, if you haven't seen photographs of this, you absolutely have to Google something like Beirut explosion 2020. This thing blew out a radius of about 10 kilometres. From the site where the explosion took place, 10 kilometres away, there were windows being blown out across the city. That's how ferocious this explosion was. And the question that was posed on the evening of my speech was to do with how that event affected me directly. But the way I want to approach this, to add more to that, is what it affects really is the illustration of the domino effect. So the domino effect is, in terms of process safety, it's what happens to secondary assets, secondary buildings, or equipment after an accident. So in an explosion, there might be a central building, of course, a central point at which an explosion takes place, but that's not the only thing that's destroyed. Anything within the vicinity of the blast radius of that explosion can be seriously damaged as well. So, the first domino there is the explosion itself, but the other dominoes that fall in the domino effect are all of those secondary buildings and assets or vehicles, you name it, that are affected by that initial blast. And where it affects me and affects us more closely is that the domino effect is the short-term, well-known, well-established effect in process safety of all these things that happen within a very short time after an accident. Where we're going with the domino fallacy is to really raise awareness and pick up on the fact that we don't look at all those other dominoes that fall over a much, much longer period of time. And that's why I illustrate this point through the story of my dad and, a lot of the struggles that he had with alcoholism and post-traumatic stress. Those things didn't become evident until much further down the line. So that's how the Beirut explosion is tied to what I've been talking about. It's the fact that the Beirut explosion shows very, very clearly the short-term domino effect, other things being damaged by the central explosion. And what we're doing is complementary to that, looking at the domino fallacy and the unspoken long-term effects of an accident that play out over years and perhaps even decades. And of course, it's not simply that these things play out over many, many years, but the domino fallacy really accounts for the fact that this can play out over many, many people. I mentioned in some of the descriptions of how these accidents can play out over a long time that it affects family members. One thing I actually rarely speak about when I'm presenting on my father's story is the fact that my younger brother was with my dad when he died, and that's no doubt had a massive effect on my brother as much as my dad. And certainly the whole experience has had a lasting impact on our family. I'm sure any one of us would rather things were very different. For now, I want to move on to the last part of episode 6, which is going to cover some of the questions that we got on the evening of my speech that you've just heard, that we simply didn't have time to answer on that occasion. For context, on the speech that you heard, it was part of a bigger event, so there was an allotted time slot. Normally, doing this sort of thing, I would spend as much time as anyone would give me to answer all of the questions that people had. But we answered some on the night, and we've got a few extra ones that I'll address here. And first of two main additional questions that we received, I'd like to address here was from Christopher Tran from Cal State Channel Islands. And Chris asked, can you say more about the Sherry Sanji UCLA event and the Thea Ekins Coward Hawaii University accidents? Yeah, these were two cases that I mention in addition to my father's story to exemplify how really serious accidents can play out over a very long time, and how through the lens of the domino fallacy concept we can understand that the longer term effects often times fall out of the public consciousness, and we don't quite realise beyond the initial few reports of what the accident actually was, what is now happening over an extended period of time. So in the first case, the story of Sherry Sanji, the 23-year-old postgraduate student at UCLA who lost her life as a result of a lab fire. She was, this was back in 2008, at the time she was dealing with a really pyrophoric chemical known as tertiary butyl lithium. The details of that, if you're not a chemist, don't matter, other than to say that if you had this chemical in a syringe and pushed that syringe at high speed such that you ejected the liquid out of the syringe into an arc across the air, before that chemical reached the ground, it's highly likely that you'll have created an arc of fire. The chemical's so reactive that it very quickly and violently reacts with the moisture in the air and combustion. In the case of Sherry Sanji's story, that resulted in a fire which led to extensive third-degree burns over her body, and she died as a result of those injuries in hospital. But in terms of further details for Chris's question, what I want to emphasise, the reason that I talk about this story as a parallel with my father's story is the fact that in that particular case, the Sherry's case, some of the legal proceedings against her lab leader who hadn't done enough in terms of exemplifying and laying down the correct safety culture for that lab, that took over a decade. And it just made me think, it still does make me think of Sherry's family and the fact that you have to play out the details of the accident and constantly remind yourself that your daughter's no longer with you. I mean, these things will never rest. In the case of my dad, this will never rest. All of this stuff that I'm doing now is, it's a way to come to terms with that. It's a way to have something good come of it. But when I think of the case of Sherry Sanji and knowing what I know about my family's personal story, you wouldn't wish it on anyone to have to play out the details of why your family member isn't with you anymore, especially in the case where they really have been taken before their time during an accident that could so easily have been prevented. So that's why I talk about Sherry Sanji and UCLA, because it links to my dad's story through the general concept of the domino fallacy that I've been writing about, the fact that the accident itself is just the start of many things to come, just the start of many things that we quite desperately cannot see clearly in the short term, because they only emerge over a much longer period of time. The second story that I speak about is similar to Sherry Sanji's story in that it was in a chemical lab, not in a process scale industry like oil and gas and Piper Alpha or, chemical manufacturing. scale. This was a small scale research laboratory. But unlike the case of Sherry Sanji, the unfortunate student who was at the heart of this second story, Dr. Thea Ekins Coward, survived. But she survived with rather brutal mutilation to her body. She lost a large portion of her right arm during this lab explosion that I mentioned in the speech. And I've written about this side by side with the story of Sherry. And again, I will link you to in the description to the articles where I've said even more detail and given some of the references. But yeah, in the case of Thea, I watched some news reports about 3 years after the accident, which occurred in 2016, to see that Thea's legal team were still battling for her and still investigating the safety deficiencies in the lab that Thea was working in at Hawaii University at the time of her accident. But I also looked at some of the detailed legal documents that initiated some of the legal proceedings, and you look at the details therein and you just realise immediately that this is more than likely the start of a very long battle to come. And once again, these are things that, whilst being done for the good of Thea and to get justice for another avoidable accident, the hardest truth from all of this, the thing that links once again to this domino fallacy concept, is the fact that there is going to be a lifetime's worth of change for Dr. Ekins Coward. Nothing's bringing back her arm. Nothing's going to stop the fact that there is a horrific series of photographs in existence now of the blood spatter and panicked footsteps running out of that lab where her accident happened. She now has to completely rethink her career that was at its, or at least towards its prime at the time of her accident. She's now looking at re-establishing herself and her livelihood that she never expected, that she never asked for. And even now, about 4 years after that particular accident, it's very, very difficult to say, without speaking to Thea directly, how this is going to affect her for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. This is, again, at the heart of the domino fallacy. These longer term details are desperately difficult to even think about, let alone project or speak about in any great detail. And the worst part of all of it is it's desperately hard to quantify. And that's why a lot of these longer term ideas are missing from the concepts in process safety or safety management. What I'm doing here is trying to raise awareness of this fact so that somehow, some way, we can start to claw back these longer term consequences and try to account for them before they ever happen. So Chris Tran from Cal State Channel Islands, thanks very much for that question. I hope talking a little bit more about the UCLA and Hawaii accidents has helped, and I hope you can see why I've chose those to link to my father's story. Whilst, on the surface they seem very different, they are in fact tied together by the unobvious longer term effects that play out in each of those particular and individual stories. Okay, the next question, the second and final question that came after that speech back in August, came from Jake Jaganathan at UC Davis. Jake asks, do you think safety awareness is tied to mental health and personal care? that's an excellent question. And the short answer is yes, 100%. I'll start, as I often do, from the obvious point of view of the story that I've told about my dad. In his case, the entire thread of that story is woven together by a particular mental struggle that he faced in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which in broad strokes is the struggle to come to terms with a traumatic or really serious life-altering event that's happened in your past. As lives on in my memory and our family. I have peppered memories of speaking to my dad throughout the years, and when he was at his worst, it would just, no matter what the short-term argument or stressor might have been, a lot of what he said came back to the accident that he was a survivor of from 1988. He would just, sorry, he would speak about the helideck that he jumped from, or the people that he saw that didn't make it, the burns on his hands. He would speak about some of these things as if randomly, when some of the things that he was stressed about seemed to be on a completely different topic, but then all of a sudden he would just start talking about Piper Alpha and his ordeal again. So post-traumatic stress was very directly linked to his struggles before he died in 2011. But Jake's question about mental health being linked to safety awareness is much, much, much bigger than that story about my dad, and even much, much bigger than post-traumatic stress. I look sideways at, if I take the UK as an example, the Health and Safety Executive, the government body who curate and report safety statistics across all sectors in UK business. If you look at the most recent statistics reported from 2019, well over 500,000 people in the UK workforce reported being off work with stress, anxiety, or some other mental struggle. And as a result of those 500,000 plus workers being off with some mental struggle, there's upwards of 12, close to 13 million work days lost due to those work-related mental struggles, which is bewildering and spine-chilling enough as it is. But then, of course, the human cost links inextricably with the financial cost. And I think perhaps from 1 or 2 years previous to the most recent statistics, there was a rather memorable series of round numbers where if the overall cost to the UK of safety failures is around £1 billion, it's roughly half of that, £500 million, is due to physical accidents, but the other 500 million lost, economically speaking, is due to these work-related stress, depression, anxiety, lost work days. So when you look at it through that bigger picture, be it post-traumatic stress or something else entirely, but still within the domain of mental health, it has an absolutely massive impact, and it's something that absolutely has to be at the forefront of safety awareness. So, brilliant question, Jake, and thanks for asking it. Okay, that brings us to the end of episode 6 of the Pre-Sight podcast. I really hope you enjoyed the shortened version of my safety impact speech, and I hope that it gives you some tangible links to the long-term effects of safety beyond the story of my dad. And I hope that you can see through the lens of the domino fallacy concept that the accident is just the first domino to fall. But whatever it is that you care about, wherever you work, whoever your close family members happen to be, you can take the situation that you work in, you can think about the accidents you're trying to avoid, and you can try through this concept of thinking about the accident as the first domino to fall, and ask yourself, what are all the other dominoes that could fall over a much longer period of time should that accident ever occur? Stay safe, folks. Stay well. And we'll see you again soon for episode 7 of the Pre-Sight podcast.